dear friend and colleague, Rabbi Meir Goldstein, who is the rabbi from Oregon Hillel and also a professor at the University of Oregon, teaching all sorts of interesting Jewish studies topics. And I'm excited to really get into some really important issues. So welcome to the podcast, Rabbi Meir.
It's my pleasure, Rabbi Daniel. It's such a joy to see you again, and always good to talk with you, my friend.
So we've been talking a lot, and of course, it's no surprise to any listeners that the last couple of weeks have been clearly an inflection point in Jewish history, and only time will tell just how much in, say, 100 years from now, people will look back to the events of both October 7th and the subsequent wider backlash that both Israel and the American Jewish community are experiencing. But I thought we'd actually take this opportunity to look backwards a little bit and look at our history and our sources to see if we can have any either guidance or chizuk, any strength in this time. And something that I know that we discuss a lot, and something that I know that is particularly your expertise, is the rise of both Jewish mysticism known as Kabbalah, and of course the subsequent repackaging of that in the Chassidut movement. So let's start exactly there. Just to put the frame for my listeners, the brief history, and then I'll pass it over to you and can fill in more of the details. For many of our listeners are probably aware that in the medieval period in Spain was probably one of the richest and most robust times in Jewish life. And I'm talking from around roughly the year 950 to the year, say, 1300 in different parts of Spain. Obviously, I'm making a huge generalization there, but generally that time is known as the golden age of either Islam or the golden age of medieval Spain. And that's when we have Maimonides and the Zohar and all these interesting books. But then, of course, what happens in the 15th century is the Jewish community of Spain and Portugal are expelled after the Inquisition. And that community, really spreads out throughout the Jewish world. Some go to North Africa, some to Amsterdam, some to the Americas. But a couple of those Jews end up in Sfat and end up really applying some of the more esoteric ideas of Kabbalah into what some scholars call Lurianic Kabbalah. And it's there that I want to start off in terms of our history point, because Isaac Luria takes a lot of these esoteric ideas about God having 10 essences that are part of the universe and what does that mean, and applies it into a way that I actually think gives a light to a lot of the pain and suffering and portrays Judaism, even at one of the darkest times in our history, towards the positive. So let's start right there. Not no time for easy introductions here. I'm not going to ask you a first question like, how did you get into this? But can you paint the picture a little bit for who Isaac Luria is, who is the Arizal, why it's Sfat in the 16th century, what was so important about what happened there?
Yeah. Thank you. Great. All right, so as Rabbi Daniel started us off, so we have what was the largest community in global Jewry, Sephardi Jewry, or Spanish and Portuguese Jewry. Spanish Jewry in particular, much of whom were welcomed in by the Ottoman Empire, who at the time was ruling over the land of Israel, and welcomed in many Jews. And so there are many Jewish refugees who are fleeing there. In Sfat, in particular, becomes an inflection point where many gather, particularly in the third quarter of the century. And Rabbi Isaac Luria is there, Rabbi Joseph Caro, who both writes one of the most important, if maybe the most important, depending on who you ask, code of Jewish law, the Shulchan Aruch, along with some of the most important Kabbalistic writings, as in Tomer Devorah, that have ever been written, both of those, and many others as well. So without just spending all our time name dropping amazing rabbis, to think through what their project was as a whole, if we take a moment to think through these great sages, these scholars, they're trying to understand the crisis of their moment. As you laid out for us, there was this thriving Jewish community that was not thriving for a number of years until finally there was complete destruction, inquisition, and exile. And so Rabbi Isaac Luria, the Arizal, the Ramak, the rabbis in the age wanted to understand how did this happen? how is it possible that God, the source of the whole world, and did this, or allowed this to happen at the very least, and now we're in exile. The world has been destroyed. And so we end up with, if we look at specifically the Kabbalah in the era, what we end up seeing is the construction of new ways of thinking through both creation and destruction. So we look at the Arizal, Rabbi Isaac Luria, and we think about his cosmology and the Sfirot and the idea of God hiding God's self, God constructing and destroying worlds, the shattering of vessels, the casting about of Nitzotzot Kadoshim, of holy sparks. Many of these are tropes that we've seen before. Jews certainly are not, the idea of exile is not new to Judaism. It's been a part of our story since the get-go. But trying to take the material that was already there in Jewish literature and Kabbalistic literature and in halakhic literature and all the different veils of Jewish understanding of how to live in the world, they're trying to answer the question, A, how did this happen? B, why did this happen? And C, what do we do now? How do we live in this post-destruction world, the destruction of the Sephardi community? How do we live now in exile from Sfarad, from the land of Spain? On the one hand, we've returned back to our homeland, the place where Jews are originally from, and but in a new venue, in Sfat, and so there's newness, there's oldness, there's stories, and they're really trying to get to the root of, well, what now?
Yeah, so you had dropped a couple of very loaded and important theological terms, the scattering of the sparks, the breaking of the vessels. I'll give a brief 20-second overview of some of those Isaac Lurianic concepts, and then I'll ask some more pointed questions your way. So Isaac Luria had a cosmology dealing with a central religious paradox that, at least to the best of my knowledge, isn't dealt with by a lot of earlier Jewish medieval thinkers. Or certainly many of our listeners are probably familiar with the classic religious questions of 1, why do bad things happen to good people? 2, how do people have free will if God knows everything that's going to happen? Those are sort of already discussed questions. The Talmud gets into that. Early medieval thinkers get into that. Isaac Luria changes the question a little bit, at least according to my understanding of him, where Isaac Luria, based off of the Zohar and the Kabbalistic concept that it isn't actually just monotheism, meaning in terms of what we think about when we think of the God of the Tanakh or the God of the Talmud, or even to some extent the God of Maimonides, where God can almost be thought about as, well, certainly not in Maimonides' case, but in the Tanakh and Talmud case, almost the more immature, super powerful entity that has emotions, that interacts with the world, but is somehow separate than the universe. The Zohar in the 13th century really shakes up that concept and really suggests that no, actually, God is infused within everything, which then begs the question, if God is in everything, if God is in this pen that I'm holding, if God is in your hat, if God is in me, how can anybody speak as Daniel as a distinct entity from God? And where does free will come from? Where does anything that isn't the infinite, the Ein Sof and Kabbalistic, where does that come from? Because as many of the students listening to this say are engineering or physics majors, infinity plus 3 is the same thing as infinity minus 3, right? The 3 is irrelevant. And so Isaac Luria suggests that perhaps, and you can tell me if you agree with this depiction of Luria in a second, he suggests that actually in the beginning of creation, before God even says, let there be light, right? In the very beginning, God actually had to mitzamtzem, or God had to constrict God's self and actually create the universe and everything we know to be the universe as actually a godless void. And after creating that void of darkness, God then wanted to send sparks. And those sparks of light came in vessels or kelim. And that was the 10 essences of God that, for people who are familiar with the Zohar and the Tree of Life and the 10 Sefirot, those are the Sefirot. But something terrible happened, right, in Lurianic cosmology, which is those vessels shattered. And in my opinion, this is a metaphor for saying that because the world is devoid of God, we are at a point where there is brokenness and there is darkness now into the world. And as those vessels shatter throughout the world, he then re-puts human beings, or specifically the Jewish people, at the center of cosmology, because now our job is not simply to follow the Torah and the Talmud because, well, as the Torah says, if we do it, God will bless us, and if we don't do it, God will curse us, or maybe as the Talmud suggests, where there's heaven and hell. But all of a sudden, humans become the prime fundamental actor for not just repairing the world, but actually fixing God in some way. And so it completely switches the vantage point of humans need God to actually know in some way, according to Lurianic Kabbalah, God needs humans. And the one I want to see, do you agree with that wider framework? What grade would I get in your class when you teach this? So we'll start with that question, then we'll go into another question I have based off that.
That's great. And the truth of the matter is we're already getting to the place where I don't know. I'm getting to the place where I want to answer you, but I know my answers are on how early Hasidic thinkers read Lurianic Kabbalah. So I can't actually answer you completely from Tzfat in the 16th century to that question. But I would say two things. I will know two things that predate Tzfat. So you mentioned Zohar, and certainly the very important phrase in the Zohar becomes more important in Tzfat and becomes even in Lurianic Kabbalah and becomes even more important for the Hasidic thinkers is Leita Tar Panui Mine, right? That there is no place that's without God, which is to say God is to be found in every place, which is certainly a radical shift from the medieval philosophers, as you mentioned, Rambam and others from before. In fact, Rambam thought the Kabbalists were even more heretical than the Christians. So Rambam, in his own way, said, well, the Christians turned God into 3, but the Kabbalists turned God into 10, and just didn't understand the project very much.
Yeah. And yeah, it is interesting. And, I actually quoted that Maimonides quote in class the other day. And I joked, once you're splitting God, you might as well have more, why not 15? But just as a joke. So, but one of the things
you get a God and you get a God and
exactly,
you get a God.
Yeah. I mean, listen, it's like in Israel, you have 7 million prime ministers because everybody thinks they know what to fix the country. So one of the things that Luria focuses on that's always stunned me, and so this will be the last question about Luria, and then we'll really go to your expertise, which is early Chassidut. But if you look at classic Jewish theology of exile, and I'm talking both from the Tanakh perspective of why was the first temple destroyed, or the Talmud perspective of why was the second temple destroyed, or even a lot of the medieval exegetes or philosophers, the line of why bad things happened, especially to Jews, was because of ourselves, because of our sins, right? Whether it's because we were, not treating each other with kindness, right? That's the Talmud's answer for why the second temple was destroyed, right? And there's a whole array of equivalent, right? We can look to the book of Devarim or Deuteronomy. We can look to the writings of Nachmanides, right? They all sort of tie in some way that if something bad is happening to the Jewish people as a whole, that's because in some way we are defective, right? As it says in the Musaf, right? Because of our sins, we were exiled. Isaac Luria takes that framework and flips it on its head. One of the most impressive things that I found about Lurianic Kabbalah is he specifically says, you actually have it all wrong. You think that exile is a divine punishment for something that has happened, and the fact that Jews are spread around the globe is because of some defectivity in our actions. Perhaps it's actually the opposite. Perhaps in order to fulfill this project of collecting the sparks and tikkun olam, when I say tikkun olam, repairing the world, I'm talking about the old school Lurianic concept, not the way that it's often used in the 21st century in synagogues, although maybe eventually we'll get there. There is a connection. But the reason why Jews are spread around from Austria to Hungary to Poland to Iran, Iraq, Syria, the Americas, right? If we're thinking of Jewish history from the 16th century, it's specifically because there's work to do in all of those places. And that it's not just about, right, as opposed to earlier forms of Jewish thought that had a much more narrow focus, right? It was about, particularism. Kabbalah in some way radically universalizes the Jewish project and says, actually, it's a good thing if you're in Tzfat and I'm in Amsterdam and my friend is in Iran, because there's work to do in all of that. Do you have any intuition for, is Isaac Luria the one to come up with that shift, or what do you know about that specific idea of exile as a positive?
It's a fantastic question. It certainly becomes important even at the very beginning of the Hasidic movement. Stories of the best included the Baal Shem Tov, the founder, the founding figure of the movement. The Magi talks about it. The first really like systematic organizer. So if you can point to, let's put it this way, I don't know of an earlier time in which people are talking about gathering in the sparks. We certainly have a language of Tikkun Olam that goes all the way back to Mishnah, but as you know, it meant something very different then as well. So, sorry about that. Right, but in terms of the idea of it's a good thing that Jews are spread around the world because there's important work for us, spiritual work for us to do in the world, and also theurgic work that we do in order to impact and not only help ourselves and the world, but also to help out God. I didn't know of that being a pre-Hasidic thought. So if that's already found in the Arizal, then that's the earliest I know of it.
Incredible. So I will tell the listeners, we did talk about 20 minutes ago before we recorded, and I promised we'd quickly get to the birth and subsequent spread of Chassidut and Hasidic thought. That's really Rabbi Meir's specialty. So I will remove you from Tzfat, and we will reappear in Eastern Europe. But just again to paint the picture, and then I'll stop with the Baal Shem Tov. As one could imagine, the Jewish world in the 1600s was particularly a rough time, right? Really the 15 and 1600s for the Sephardic Jews. Of course, this was right after the Inquisition and subsequent expulsion. And meanwhile, in the Ashkenazi world, at that point, a lot of Jews were continuously getting pushed east within the Christendom because of medieval anti-Semitism caused by the church. And so there were a bunch of famous expulsions of Ashkenazi Jews from places like England and France. And so Jews were continuously getting pushed eastward to the Poland, Russia, Ukraine area. And then, of course, in the 1600s, the Ashkenazi Jewry faces one of the pre-Holocaust, what is by just a numbers count, the worst massacre in Jewish history, the Chalmanesky massacre. It was a Ukrainian nationalistic uprising against what they consider to be the Polish overlords. But of course, as so often happens in Jewish history, Jews get implicated as well. They're bad too, right? Obviously, there's a little more nuance there. So sorry to any scholars of that period that I'm just completely generalizing there. But these concepts of Isaac Luria don't just stay in Tzfat, and they, of course, spread around to the rest of the Jewish world, which, of course, culminates, right? A whole other podcast we'll one day have to do about Shabtai Tzvi, because one of the most interesting characters of Jewish history that nobody knows about, but we'll package that for later. He was a false messiah that used the conversations and these ideas of Isaac Luria to claim himself the Messiah. It didn't end well, in case at home you're thinking of copying him. But eventually, these ideas are on the wane after Shabtai Tzvi, because Jewish leaders get very skeptical of a lot of these ideas. And so in the mid to late 1600s, there seemed to be a anti-mystical backlash to some extent as a result of Shabtai Tzvi. And then all of a sudden we're introduced to the Baal Shem Tov, who you'll take away in a second, but he really takes a lot of these more ancient mystical ideas. And again, this is at another time of lachrymosity and sorrow for Ashkenazi Jewry in Eastern Europe. And the Baal Shem Tov becomes the first figure in a movement that really changes the entire course of Jewish history. And one of the things that I just want to say to preface this, and then we'll start with Baal Shem Tov in a second, for the listeners at home, that when I say Hasidic Jews, and the only thing you're picturing in your head are modern day Jews who identify as Hasidic with the shtreimel and the black hat, or of course Chabad, which is the most visible Hasidic movement, I want to take a step back and just explain just how big of a transition Hasidic Jewry and the ideas of Hasidism had on all modern forms of Judaism. I don't think it's hyperbolic to say I don't believe that Reform Judaism ever would have happened if it wasn't for the Hasidic movement. I don't believe Zionism ever would have happened if it wasn't for the Hasidic movement. I'll defend those positions later once Rabbi Meir introduces us. But start us off. Who was the Baal Shem Tov? What was his project? What do we know about him since he didn't write a lot? And how did his ideas then become part of this new all-important Jewish movement?
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Okay, so we have the Baal Shem Tov, whose dates are 1700 to 1760, and he was a local medicine man. He was a local spiritualist. There were many folks who were in this category of a Shem Tov. It was someone who would either sometimes make amulets, sometimes say certain prayers to keep away demons. There was a lot. It was a folk position in the shtetl, in the Jewish community. These ideas started earlier, as Rabbi Daniel mentioned. 1648, we have the Chmielewski massacre, and life changed on a dime for Polish Jewry and Ashkenazim in general in the area, especially Polish Jewry. But prior to that was the golden age of Polish Jewry. We had mentioned the golden age of Spanish Jewry. It's the golden age of Polish Jewry right up until that minute.
This is just making me think we should stop label periods golden ages, and it never really ends well for who's there.
Right. Golden ages don't end well, and neither do messiahs, as it turns out. Jewish messiahs never end well for the Jews. So, right, and I guess I just bring it up because there was the largest amount of autonomy and self-sovereignty that the Jewish community, certainly in Ashkenaz, had ever experienced up until 1648, more or less. And so you have the Council of the Four Lands, you have Jews ruling over themselves to some degree. It's not a current multicultural Western society, but it was pretty darn good. But to go from that to the shattering of the pogroms, the sheer bestial violence and the massive scale of the violence was a massive shattering of the world, and in that way, similar to what we just spoke about in regard to the Sephardi exile and the destruction of Sephardi Jewry and the beginning of the Kabbalists in Tzfat. And thank God for them, because not only do we get Lurianic Kabbalah and Chassidut, but we also get Kabbalat Shabbat. And so they bring all sorts of great things that we continue to have today. But so what we have is we have a community that was flourishing, to one that really was shocked by the anti-Jewish violence and vitriol, and then became much less unified. And so you had many smaller villages, you had that were disconnected, you had local talismen, you had local medicine men, spiritualists who filled this role of being a Shem Tov. So Rabbi Yisrael, who I'll just call the Baal Shem Tov, he's also known as the Besht, which is the acronym for his name, was in some ways a folk hero in many ways, and was a spiritualist, really focused on the Jews in his community, unlearned, everyday Jews. He wasn't focusing on the scholars as institutional Judaism was at the time, and so he created a Judaism that saw the downtrodden Jew, each and every one of them, as being holy, and whatever they were doing was holy. There's a famous story of the Baal Shem Tov going through town with some of his Hasidim, some of his students, and he saw a Jew working on a wagon wheel and on Shabbat, and violating the halakha of Shabbat. And instead of berating him. He said, do you know that today is Shabbat? And he said, yeah, I know today is Shabbat. I said, all right, Shabbat Shalom, good Shabbos, and walked on and said, every Jew has his mitzvah. Every individual, whatever you're doing, where you're at, that's where you need to be. The specific holy deed that you're doing is what the world needs, and what both what you need, what your neshama needs, what God needs, and what the world needs from you. And in that way, we see a very localized and not non-intellectual approach to these very heady ideas that we just discovered in regard to the shattering of the sparks. And just set all that aside and just say, look, right now what you're doing is lifting up sparks of holiness. You're just an everyday Jew. You don't have to know how to read the Talmud. You don't have to know how to paskin halacha, how to make a decision, a halakhic decision, but you too are living a good and meaningful life, even in these times of darkness. And so people just flock to him.
That's really incredible. And I want to also highlight, and I don't want to spend too much time on this direction, so I'll flag this ahead of time. And we actually, the first time we had a deep conversation was at a Rabbi's conference last year in Chicago. And one of the reasons why I really connected with this friendship, or just tell the listeners, is that I believe me and you were sitting around one afternoon, and there was a third colleague there, and they were asking a question about the reason behind a certain Jewish ritual. I forgot what it was. Maybe it was a sukkah or something like that. And we each took a crack at an answer. And your answer was so infused with Hasidic concepts, and mine, my background is very Litvak, very modern Orthodox. Mine was much more the sort of Maimonidean rationalistic perspective, and I just laughed and said, it is so great that we have these dual traditions. I'm only flagging this because I can imagine some listeners almost being shocked at the sort of antinomian approach of the Baal Shem Tov, where for hundreds, if not thousands of years, to be a quote unquote good Jew, and I'm not using that term in terms of a normative statement now, but a descriptive statement of, if you took a poll in 1670 of Jewish leaders, what does it mean to be a good Jew? Somebody would say, certainly an allegiance to Jewish law, and to be a good Jew would mean an allegiance to studying Talmud, and somebody who understood both Talmud and the subsequent commentaries. And all of a sudden the Baal Shem Tov says, not only is that not the only way to be a good Jew, but there's actually goodness in really everything, even simple acts that actually break Jewish law, right? The other Baal Shem Tov story that I know and love, that I teach, is the story of the ignorant child who was brought to synagogue on Yom Kippur, and he's sitting there and feels completely lost because he's never, and this is an experience that I can imagine a lot of listeners here that maybe, just like today, Yom Kippur is, if you're going to spend one day in synagogue, sociologically, it's usually Yom Kippur, although for a whole variety of reasons, I think that's a terrible idea, but that's for another podcast. It was the same thing in Eastern Europe in the 1700s. And so you had a lot of these peasants that would come in on their one day of the year. And the story goes that this child is so overwhelmed by emotion, but doesn't know any of the words, that he takes out a flute, which according to the laws of Yom Kippur, you are not allowed to play instruments on Yom Kippur, and he starts playing the flute, and all the other synagogue goers, you can imagine the shushing or trying to silence it, and the Baal Shem Tov, quiets everybody down and says, all day long, the gates of heaven were closed to our prayers, but the flute, there was so much spirituality behind it that it burst the gates open. Now, that's simultaneously a beautiful story, and also a extremely challenging to traditional story, right? Not in my view, but in the view of many people at the time who sort of saw this as an attack on, as you said before, the religious institution, which I just think is fascinating to paint. Hasidic Judaism in 2023 sadly gets painted as the most conservative tradition at all costs type of Judaism, whereas how you're explaining the Baal Shem Tov, and I'd love you to elaborate a little bit on this, was really actually challenging the tradition, challenging religious institutions, challenging leadership.
Yes, I don't have much to challenge there. I think that's a really great framing for the Baal Shem Tov. And we move on very quickly from the Baal Shem. The story of Chassidut moves on very quickly because the story of Chassidut begins with the Baal Shem Tov's disciple and his disciples. So when the Baal Shem Tov himself becomes in many ways a figurehead, of whom there's some really important stories that are told, and that become emblematic for the new movement. But the movement really doesn't start under his leadership. We really have to shift to one of his two critical disciples. There's actually three main disciples of the Baal Shem Tov, and there's some vying and jockeying to see who's gonna take over this nascent movement, and it ends up being Rabbi Dov Ber, known as the Magid, or the Magid of Mezrich, because he lived in Mezrich. So, but we'll just call him the Magid. So the Magid, who only lives 12 years longer than the Baal Shem Tov, the Magid, Alav Hashalom, died in 1772. The Magid, unlike the Baal Shem Tov, had smicha. He had rabbinic ordination, and he knew scholarship. He knew rabbinic Judaism in a very deep way, in a very learned way, that we can't say is true about the Baal Shem Tov. So the Baal Shem Tov is essential to the movement. What's even more essential to the movement is the image and the stories and the hagiography of the Baal Shem Tov and what he comes to represent. Because what the Magid does is he ends up bringing a whole new lens. He brings a lot of traditional teachings, traditional Jewish teachings, and then flips them on their head, creates new ways to understand. So let me give you an example. So first, there's a teaching from a later Hasidic Rebbe. I believe it's from the Opta Rebbe. So that's Reb Avram Yehoshua Heschel from the town of Opt. He's the first Rebbe from Opt. And for those of you who are fans of Abraham Joshua Heschel, this is his great grandfather, maybe great. You have to check me on the generations there. But what the Opta Rebbe said is, if you think about these two founding figures in Chassidut, you think about the Baal Shem Tov and you think about the Magid, one great way to understand what they each brought in terms of their teaching and in terms of their Torah into the world is if you think about the first two lines of Psalm 92. Tov lahodot l'Adonai l'zameh l'shimcha l'avyon lahagid baboker chasdecha ve'emunatcha balelot. Lahagid baboker chasdecha, to speak about God's loving kindness, presence, faith in the morning, ve'emunatcha balelot, and God's faith in us, or God's commitment to us in the darkness. And what the Baal Shem Tov was all about was bringing the love and gratitude and joy and in the light of life. And the Magid brought bringing emunah, faith and commitment through the darkness of life. And they in many ways were a foil to each other. Their Torah was a foil to each other, and the fusion of the two is part of what's at the radioactive holiness at the heart of the beginning of the Hasidic movement.
So that's fascinating. So what would you capture as, so let's get more from the history more down to the ideas. We sort of started this conversation with framing, both in terms of the inflection points in Jewish history, in terms of things turning from good, if not, medium livable, to really downtrodden, both for the Sephardic community with Kabbalah or the Ashkenazi community. What are some of the ideas that really took hold in the 1700s, and then we'll get into the 1800s in a little bit, because then we could talk about Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, who's my favorite Hasidic thinker. But let's stick to the 1700s for a moment. What were sort of some of the ideas that you find most powerful and most in opposition to, let's say, the predominant Lithuanian? Just for the listeners to know, the Vilna Gaon in Lithuania was sort of the predominant outspoken opponent of the early Hasidic movement. So he famously or infamously, depending on who you are, excommunicated the Baal Shem Tov, and he really tried to stop these ideas from a position of power and authority. The sort of irony or whatever word you want to use for it is because a lot of early Hasidic ideas were specifically a bottom-up type movement, right? A lot of people are shocked to hear that because today Hasidic Judaism is the most hierarchical type of Judaism where the Rebbe is almost seen in some sects to be a quasi-divine figure. But that doesn't necessarily happen until a little bit later. Hasidic Judaism originally started off as a movement of the people, as Meir suggested before, a simple people, right? The simple Yid or the simple Jew has just as much to contribute to the world as the Talmudic savant, which when those ideas got to the rabbinic leadership, specifically the Vilna Gaon, right, those ideas were anathema. One, because right, the sort of, one way to view it is because it challenged his authority. I think the more nuanced way to view it is it challenged what he believed to be the correct way to practice Judaism. And he thought that this was just, wrong, right, in some objective sense. But whatever we think of that debate aside, what were a lot of those ideas that you find most powerful and most lasting into Judaism today that a lot of listeners might be surprised to find out that the idea X or thing X that we do was really actually just in the early 1700s or mid 1700s by early Hasidic masters?
Yeah, that's great. We're going to dive into these ideas in 1 minute. And I just want to put one more historical piece that we have to, I feel like I just need to name before we dive into it, because some of the ideas are going to come from. So these are from the students of the Magid. So we just spoke a moment ago about, we have the Baal Shem Tov, very founding father of the Chassidut. Then we have the Magid, his primary disciple. And then around the Magid's table, he had a number of he had a number of students that each bring Chassidut to a new place. So you have we mentioned Chabad Chassidut. Many of you are familiar with Chabad, the founding figure of Chabad Chassidut. Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi was a student of the Magids. He's in the third generation. We also have the Kedushat Levi, for those of you who know him. He brings Chassidut to Berdichev and other places. We have Rabbi Menachem Nachum Twersky, the Meir Einayim, who brings Chassidut to Chernobyl. We have the Noam Elimelech of Lezhinsk. We have a number of scholars who not only learn at the Magid's feet, and they learn some of the core ideas that we're going to speak about in 1 minute, then they bring these ideas out to Jews in small shtetls and in larger Jewish communities that don't have that otherwise had no connection to Chassidut before. So we're going to talk about what it is they brought. And okay, that's enough for history. We keep going on that. So okay, so some of did you want to add anything to that? Or?
No, I was going to joke that there are very few topics that once we start talking about, unless somebody cuts us off very consciously, we're not just going to go for 2 hours about. So history is definitely one of those. So let's transition to some of those ideas.
True. Excellent. Gosh. Okay. One of the essential philosophic moves that early Chassidut makes is to excise the world of the heter, of the mutar, of that which is permissible. So if we think about what the rabbinic world, that is to say, what Judaism was like at that very moment, and all the centuries before, but at that very moment, outside the door of the Magid's table and his students, the world from a lived Jewish experience could be divided up into 3 areas. There was the things you had to do, that your chiyuv, your obligation. There are things that you were forbidden from doing. There was your whatever's asur or your isur, whatever that you were forbidden from doing. And then there's this whole wide world of things that you could do if you wanted to. There's a whole world of the heter.
Yeah, right? And so just to give listeners, sorry to cut you off, just to give listeners a very concrete example, right? So eating cheeseburgers, that is something you are not allowed to do. Laying to fill in for Jewish males, at least in the rabbinic mind, something you have to do. And something like drinking a cup of coffee with a friend in the morning, right? That's something that is not, you don't need to do it. You don't not have to do it, but that is something that is in this gray area of mutar. So just as one concrete example.
Right. Great. That's excellent. All right. And what, you can't eat a cheeseburger, it's forbidden. But if you want to eat, you can eat a hamburger. You can eat a kosher hamburger. You're like, hey, gesund, right? But you don't have to eat a hamburger. You're not Popeye, or what's his friend? Brutus? Whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah. Bluto? Man, I don't know. It's been a long time. So right, but there are loads of things that you don't have to do. In fact, the majority of life are things that you don't have to do, but you could do if you wanted to do, or there's a way you could do them if you wanted to do. So early Hasidic movement says, no, because specifically for the reason, the flip side of the idea that anything you do is potentially holy, then that conflates out, that flattens out the idea of this whole thing, that if you want to do it, you can do it. Is if you could possibly do something, and it's a holy act that you could raise up those shards of light, then oh my gosh, how could you not possibly want to go and do that? Even if it's not technically a mitzvah, even if you're not chiyuv, if there's no chiyuv, there's no obligation to go and do it. But how could you possibly not want to bring more light into the darkness and bring more joy into the world, bring more warmth into the coldness?
So what you're saying, just because this is a concept I'm aware of, I'm not super familiar with it, at least how you just laid it out. Are you saying in this example that I don't have to eat a cheeseburger, but if I can eat a cheeseburger, and in my eating of the cheeseburger, I make it a holy act by really contemplating, the deliciousness and how that connects to the beauty of the world and God, I then am under some Hasidic thought an obligation to eat a cheeseburger because I can make that a holy act? Or am I misunderstanding?
I wouldn't say you don't have an obligation to eat a cheeseburger. That would be Frankist. So we're not going to quite go there.
A regular burger. Sorry. I meant a regular burger. Right. Yes.
Yeah. Yes. It's hard to construct exactly how that would bring light, but there definitely are. Like I was at a Chassid's house in Tzfat, just not in the 16th century. It just feels that way now. It was in the late 20th century. I was at a Chassid's house, and at the time I was a vegetarian, and he was having chicken. He offered me the chicken. I said, no, thank you, but I don't eat chicken. And he's told me, no, I should really eat the chicken because the chicken's neshama, his soul, would cling to my soul. And then when I davened when I prayed in the morning and late fell in the morning, that would be able to elevate the chicken soul to God in a way that his soul couldn't otherwise. And like, okay, this is not my worldview, and this may not be your worldview, but this isn't it's a very good example of how doing something as mundane as eating a piece of chicken could possibly have significance in the spiritual world in a very real way.
On behalf of what all of our listeners are wondering, did you eat the chicken?
No.
Okay. Fair enough. So
what can I say? At that point of my life, my commitment to being a vegetarian was more important than my commitment to the soul of the chicken. So what can I tell you?
Fair enough. You were too worried about the gashmiut, the body of the chicken, and the ruchniut, the soul of the chicken. So you're painting this picture of Hasidic Judaism, again, making the mundanity holy in a way that practical halacha or Talmudic Judaism never really worried about the sort of average task. And this seems well connected to this idea that the everyday, simple Jew who's a farmer or merchant or peasant can live just as holy of a life as somebody poring over the Talmud for 15 hours a day. Because if you are a farmer, or you're a dairy farmer, your act of milking cows and everything, if done in the correct intention or manner or for the right reasons, that can become just as holy of an act as if I lock myself in a Beit Midrash and end up studying Talmud for 15 hours a day, which is what the Jewish leadership in other places of Europe viewed as the ideal way to be a Jew. My Freudian slip before when I said, eating the cheeseburger to make it holy, I heard you say Jacob Frank. Even before Jacob Frank, I mean, one of the things, this is just an interesting tangent for listeners, I'm really hoping people will listen to this podcast and then spend the next 4 days just constantly researching, both the text that we're referring to and these figures, because I think for a lot of people, they've never really heard of Jewish concepts talked in this way. But Shabtai Tzvi and sort of one of his later followers, a guy named Jacob Frank, took this idea of Hasidic Judaism, that the way that you perfect the world is by doing something that's permitted for holy purposes. And they went one step further and said, once God and holiness is infused in everything, perhaps actually the real leaders are the ones who are actually able to sin for the sake of holiness. And this concept that, of course, never caught on in mainstream Judaism, even though Rabbi Nachman of Breslov sometimes actually hinted to this concept as well, that actually there's a way to do an aveira l'shem mitzvah, right? To do a sin for the sake of a mitzvah. But this is why, to some extent, this could be seen as a slippery slope for thrusting off all religious obligation, because once everything is holy and anything can be made holy, why then on a Tuesday morning do I need to schlep myself to synagogue to daven in a minyan and lay tefillin, when according to some version of this, I can go into a forest and I can meditate on God for an hour, and that might be more spiritually satisfying. So listeners can quickly see the slippery slope, even amongst, and why much of the Jewish leadership originally was opposed to these ideas, even though these ideas ended up catching on, and I think ended up entering into the Jewish mainstream to the point where virtually now all contemporary Jewish practice is informed in some way by this. I don't know if you had anything to add. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. Two pieces. So Daniel, what you laid out in terms of the Shabbatian notions and later Frankist notions of committing sins for the sake of finding the holiness inside of them and elevating the sparks that are found inside the sin, like committing like incest or adultery, God forbid. Like those are examples of something that some Frankists did for sure, in order to find the holiness in those moments and elevate God's presence there. Because remember, this is rooted in that old Zoharic notion of leitatar apanui mineh, that there is no place absent God. And actually, if you want to be honest about it, that's true for all mysticism. It's not only Kabbalah, it's not only Jewish mysticism. All mysticism has the goal of unifying the practitioner with God in the moment, not just studying about it, but actually experiencing God in the moment. And if God is found anywhere, then that actually abrogates any normative, any norms, and any certainly any legal system or limits, because God is to be found anywhere. And that was one of the claims against the early Hasidic movement, that you're moving this direction also. And so early on, this notion that we're talking about, the Hebrew phrase for it is Yeridah L'Tzorech Aliyah, which is going down in order to come up. But the idea, it becomes very clearly defined. That's fascinating. It becomes very, very, very clearly defined that there are normative limits, that when we talk about going down, we're talking about finding holiness anywhere, finding the sparks and elevating sparks wherever they're found. We're saying within the halachic parameters of what's allowed. So if you're talking about in the case of, say, incest or adultery, those are forbidden. They're verboten al pi halakha. They're forbidden according to halakha, and so they're not allowed. But up to that point, you can still find sparks of holiness anywhere, and so you should elevate those wherever they're to be found. So there's a back and forth at the very beginning, because all mysticism is inherently, what would you say, antinomian. It's inherently, it kind of knocks you, it can knock you off your foundation. It's destabilizing.
And it's the same thing. Yeah, go for it. Well, I'm just going to say it's the same thing. This is an ancient debate. I think, for the listeners wondering why we just cut us off, I think both of us just lagged for 2 seconds. So of course, Zoom was not created to have, two excited rabbis, talking back and forth about Chassidut. There's way too much bandwidth being used up here. But to some extent, you have this debate in the Tanakh too. I mean, if you read Isaiah and if you read Jeremiah, and you read Amos, their attacks on the temple and the ritual and the sacrifice is sort of the primary way of doing experience, where they say, of course, I mean, it's a little bit different, but to some extent, it's a similar debate of God is not to be found in the institutions. God is to be found, at least in Isaiah and Amos, in the interpersonal and in the caring for each other, right? The early Hasidic masters were teaching something a little bit different, that God is to be found not in the institutions. God is to be found in the everywhere. But it is an interesting back and forth you have in our history.
Yeah. Yeah. And it seems to be true in every civilization where you have both mysticism and you have normative practice. And there's always going to be a tension between the two. Mysticism is inherently erodes barriers and is destabilizing, and normative practice tries to create norms and lives within norms, structure and chaos. And as a human being, we need both, and we need them in good balance. When we go too far in one direction or the other, it ends up being bad for us as individuals and in relationships and communities. Right now, so part of what we're talking about, part of what ended up working so well in early Hasidic thought is that you have these mystical ideas that are, first of all, taught in a very folk way. It's intended to be something that's applicable to the everyday Jew, wherever he, and mostly he, wherever he might find himself, regardless of how good or bad it is outside. And many of those third generation Hasidic thinkers who brought their Torah to Liadi and to Chernobyl and to Berdichev and eventually to Lublin and then to Krakow in the fourth generation, like to Peshiska, and to places, let's say in today, like Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, parts of Russia, they end up getting carved out and brought into the Russian Empire at the very end of the 18th century. Poland's carved up, and the vast majority of the Jews end up in Russia. And the reason why we weren't in Russia to that point, despite the fact of all the pressures being moved east, as Rabbi Daniel mentioned before, is because of systemic Jew hatred in Russia. So all of a sudden, the czars end up with the largest Jewish community in the world, and there's this massive culture of Jew hatred, and things get really dark and bleak really quickly. So talking about a community that needs to have ideas about how to find light and how to find holiness in the everyday, that's one of the reasons why this new movement catches on so quickly. A second reason is it addresses the everyday needs of the everyday Jew, not just the scholars. And one of the things that, Rabbi Daniel, what you mentioned a moment ago when you said that the everyday Jew could be just as holy as the scholars sitting in yeshiva or sitting and learning Talmud, that's true. And in fact, it could be even more so. Either one could be more so, because because God can be found anywhere. And as long as you're not doing that which is forbidden, then everything is potentially holy, which again is that new radical idea that there's not this massive gap of if you want to do it. There is everything up to the very line of that which is forbidden is potentially holy. And it's a way to fix yourself, your relationship, your community, and ultimately the world as things are getting worse and darker. And also coming about in the crucible of there being these very, very, very serious concerns about some of the transgressions that had happened before under the Sabbatean movement, under the Frankist movement, that helped the early movement, the early Hasidic movement, to say, look, there are some clear lines that we won't cross. And that's not usually the case.
Speaking of collecting the sparks, I know for the listeners who are just listening to this and not watching the video, somehow Zoom just created some firework display behind Rabbi Meir. So listen, the Isaac Luria would be proud. This is both a chiyuv in terms of the learning Torah aspect and also mutar in terms of our conversation. So the two perfect. Yeah. So I'm looking at the time. We had said about an hour. I think we can start moving somewhat towards wrapping up, although we obviously can talk about this, I think, forever. So maybe we can do a couple more minutes. I want to just just suggest one or two things, and then you can take us whichever direction you feel like we need to go for the last couple of minutes. One, I hope by now listeners understand two important things that I wanted to highlight. One, just in terms of thinking of where we're at today in the wake of October 7th, in terms of, for me personally, it's always comforting to be aware of our history and our tradition, and to understand that this is not the first time, nor sadly do I believe it's going to be the last, that the Jewish community is in a tragic situation. And our tradition has such a resiliency built in. Obviously, different acts of resiliency. If we think of, the letter that Jeremiah sent to the exiles, or the project of the Talmud, or, the modern state of Israel, right? Different resiliencies have different attributes to them. And I don't think for a lot of our listeners, early Kabbalah and early Hasidic Judaism was thought of as a movement that was of resiliency. But hopefully this is just another way to inspire people that are very obviously and very understandably worried about where Jews are at now. The second, just for people that haven't considered early Hasidic Judaism and its effect, I think by now, right, maybe 30 minutes ago, listeners were shocked that I suggested before that I believe that at least the Reform movement, and maybe Zionism, and maybe even the Haskalah or the Enlightenment's effect on Judaism would not have been as extreme if it wouldn't have been for Hasidic Jewry. And I'm not making the case that Hasidic masters would have liked the direction that Reform Judaism, I mean, we know they didn't, because it was happening at the same time to a large extent. But a lot of these ideas that do erode the hierarchical nature of institutions and the centrality of Jewish law for this idea that everything is permitted, one can see how that then opens the door for other ways to view Judaism, and to say, right, as a very modern example, if my experience of Shabbat is uplifted getting in a car and driving to synagogue, as opposed to keeping the rigid halachic norms of not using a car, according to some Hasidic logic, right? Obviously, if you have those clear red lines, you're not going to pass that. But it's not hard to see how that more easily, right, how the ends justify the means, in a way that if you were dealing with just Talmudic law, where the ends are the means, right? There is no ultimate goal past keeping halacha and keeping Jewish law in terms of the day-to-day. One can see how that transition can go. I wanted to kick it back to you, either to respond to that, or sort of anything you think that we didn't get to touch, or anything like that.
Yeah. Well, okay. I want to respond to what you just said, and I also want to add, I think, one more piece that I'm sitting with right now, and it's another early idea. We spent a lot of time on Yeridah L'Tzorech Aliyah. There are other ideas, but that was a really important one. So let me do the early Hasidic ideas first, and then I'll do the history last, and maybe we'll wrap with that. So one of the moves the early Hasidic Rebbes, the early Hasidic rabbis taught about, was to emphasize just two midot, just two of the qualities, sometimes three, central three sfirot with central triangle, but really there's two they spend the majority of their time with, is that is found in classical Kabbalah, that is highlighted by the Arizal, by Rabbi Isaac Luria in Tzfat, when he talks about the 10 sfirot and the tree of life, as Rabbi Daniel mentioned at the beginning of the podcast. But the two central mitzvot of chesed and din, of love, loving kindness, of undifferentiated acceptance on the one hand, and on the other is justice, or judgment, or awe, or fear. There's lots of ways to understand both of these qualities, but ultimately that there is a balance that needs to exist in the healthy individual. On some level, the Hasidim in this early Hasidic thought presage what's about to come with psychology when we get there. And certainly ideas that will bubble forth in early modernity, like the idea of the self and consciousness and things that we continue in free will. It's some of the things that Rabbi Daniel led us off with. That those are some of the pieces that are within this notion of there's this tension between chesed and din. There's this tension between being just completely accepting and at one and groovy and loving and finding holiness in God everywhere. And on the one hand, all that's chesed, and on the other hand, this notion of wanting to seek clear justice and judgment and put things in their place. And some things belong in some places and they definitely don't belong in others. So that tension, and that tension resides at the core of every human being, and it's part of our wrestling to find an equanimity within that. And that every healthy, not only every healthy individual, certainly every healthy individual, but also every healthy relationship, and even within God's self, as it were, that there needs to be a healthy balance of those two. And there are, liturgical and old classical tropes that play on these, especially, we think a lot about them sometimes during the high holidays and Yom Noraim. But what the early Hasidic movement did is they're like, look, you need to be spending time with your chesed. You need to be spending time with making sure that your heart is open and that you are seeing the loving kindness and grace and blessedness of life and sharing that. And you also need to make sure to keep things in check so you don't flow everywhere. And so there's justice. So when I think about where we are now in a post-October 7th reality, I come back to these notions too. I think one of the a profound way in which this tension was said.
Sorry, I think you cut out for a second, so I stopped the recording, but
No problem. No problem. Right. Okay, sounds good. So an early rabbinic way of addressing this tension is that if you start off being kind to the cruel, then we'll end up having cruelty to the kind. And we can certainly see how that played out on October 7th. So we do need to think very clearly about justice and about the reality face the reality of evil in our world and respond with the full force of justice in order that there
think you cut out for a second. Can you hear me?
I can't. Hello?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yep, all good.
Perfect. Can you just start over from the full force of justice, and then I'll edit that?
Sure. Okay. That if we, that we're called on to bring full force of justice against those who would choose to bring cruelty into the world in order that there will be kindness to those who choose not to be cruel. It's how we find the balance between justice and chesed, justice and compassion in our world. We can't be compassionate with evil. Evil has to be responded to with justice, so that those who choose not to do evil, and when we choose to do good, we can find peace and build a society and a world based on that.
Amazing. Well, thank you again. This was such an incredible conversation. I think you've nicely planted the seeds for eventually doing a follow-up episode in terms of the last 200 years of Hasidic thought. You dropped a very interesting concept there of a lot of Hasidic concepts predating a lot of contemporary psychological concepts. That is a topic that I'm also personally very interested in. We didn't even get to talk about Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, who is my favorite Hasidic thinker. So we'll have to do a follow-up episode, but Rabbi Meir, thank you so much for coming on, for spending some time with me, for doing some learning, and for creating this fascinating piece of content for both me personally and also for our listeners.
Really a pleasure, Daniel. A pleasure to come back anytime.